So welcome. My name is Jane Callahan. Hello, Mary Jones. And most of you know me, and I'm a past president of the League, and I've been running these survey of positions on issues meetings, which everyone does in either January or early February, all the local leagues, in order to, familiarize themselves with what's going on and what has been the positions of the League. And so I'm going to say our first image, because today we're focused on the state of Minnesota. Every other year we go to convention at state, then federal, then back to state. So this is an annual sort of review, although we'll be talking about the federal today because there is this need to keep us in alignment with the national positions. So here is our state capital, which has been so much in our hearts these last few weeks. As many of you know, this is a three-tiered organization. So the local leagues really came into existence later in the 20s. In 1919, we were actually organized 6 months before they thought the vote would be passed. It was barely. Women got the right to vote in 1920 by one vote in the Tennessee legislature, but it was passed after a 72-year effort, because the right to vote was first brought up in a formal way in 1848. And so this organization sort of grew out of the suffrage organizations. They didn't want to lose all the people, all the organization they had, all the impetus and power. And so today we're looking at the state, but with our minds also on the federal government. Now, we are a nonpartisan organization. We do not endorse candidates. That was one of the reasons this was founded, because the suffragists found that a lot of the information on the candidates was so skewed by the parties that it was almost like yellow journalism. And of course, the men said, well, you can't vote because you don't know anything. When the women finally said, nobody knows anything because there isn't any objective organization doing this. And so that was the first position. But in 1920, it's interesting, I went to the national website, and there's an article about our early history. And I had always sort of thought, well, the voter service focus was always there from the beginning. But in fact, in 1920, they did take positions on what they were going to take action on, advocate before the legislatures, advocate before Congress. And the first president was Maud Wood Park, but she called this league program, adopted in 1920, a kettle of eels, which I think is a wonderful image. So they just got together and decided what they were going to do. There were no studies at that time. So here are some of the subject areas, around 69 items that they were going to lobby on. Here we go, child welfare, and that, of course, was a major goal of the suffragists, especially child labor laws, getting those in place. Education, the home and high prices. Now that sounds like a woman's issue. The high prices they were paying. Women in gainful occupations, so the whole question of women in the workplace back in 1920. Public health and morals. So they were concerning themselves. Women were considered to be sort of more moral than men. So that was their field of expertise. And they were, actually some of the people argued, if you start voting, you'll lose your moral authority. And finally, independent citizenship for married women. And I thought that was such an interesting phrase. One of the accusations was, well, women will just vote the way their husbands tell them to. And so I think we put the lie to that. Now, small local leagues were more focused on, and they still did things like registration drives, getting out the vote, getting people registered to vote, and information on candidates. But it wasn't until later that the local Know Your Town surveys and small groups came together. And part of it was because there was a bit, a sort of there wasn't the same ability to move around. Now, I'm going to just mention a couple highlights in our history. In 1928, the first national broadcast of a candidate forum was put on by the League. So that's pretty early. That's voter service, but I'm still interested in some of these milestones. In the 1930s, one of the major things they advocated for was the civil service for the federal government. And so the League was involved in getting that. Right after World War II, the League supported the formation of the United Nations, and was involved with that. In the 50s, they spoke against Joseph McCarthy. And I'll just mention that the motor voter law was passed in, I want to say 1982. Oh, and here's another thing that I really did not know. In 1960, remember the televised debate between Nixon and Kennedy was blamed by Nixon. He thought he lost the election because of that televised debate. So for the next 3 presidential debates, there was no television debate between the presidential candidates. It sounds so funny to us today because TV is such an important political tool. Well, in 1976, the League motivated itself and hosted the presidential debates, got both candidates there, it's Carter and Ford, and they won an Emmy for the debate. So the League of Women Voters has an Emmy, and it must be somewhere in the federal office building. Well, so what I learned from this, which I didn't really understand, is that we've been sort of an issue-oriented organization from the very beginning. That it wasn't just registering voters or getting people to vote, but we have been lobbying for issues from the very start. And this, by the way, this is called Through the Decades. You can read the whole thing on the national website. So what we've come out with is we basically decided to start studying the issues. So we weren't just using people's gut reactions to things. So I'm going to read to you from the state website how we adopt positions, because there's a big change here for old timers like me. LWVMN adopts positions based on careful study and consensus. To adopt a position, members must conduct sanctioned studies on an issue for a 2-year period. The recommendations from the study are brought to the larger body for a vote, and if approved, become part of the official positions supported by LWVMN. The positions formed are the basis of our advocacy work. So the end result of study and position taking is advocacy. While the League of Women Voters never supports or opposes a political candidate or party, we do advocate for our adopted positions on vital issues of concern to members and the public. And that's been true from the beginning, from 1920. But this does not use the word consensus. So as I look at Amy Cockett and people who have been in the League a long time, they have sort of just opted to say it comes down to a vote. And whenever we were trying for consensus, that everyone in the room would agree. That was the hope. And it's just impossible to really go that way. So I was surprised to see that they had jettisoned the language of the consensus. So now our positions. I think I need my next slide. Oh, actually, no, before we do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we take action on positions, and then we'll look at them. And so therefore, the first thing I want to do is highlight that, of course, the federal government is also, the Federal League is taking positions. And our next slide is the January recap, which came to all of your emails. And what this does is to inform all the membership as to what is being advocated for by the Federal League. You know, I mean, we have so many positions, you have to choose and select. And this is also an appeal to local people to be part of this process. So this reads, it's a new year. There are a lot of new faces in Washington, and the 117th Congress has made the For the People Act their top priority. The League supports this comprehensive democracy reform bill known as HR 1 in the House and Senate 1 in the Senate. So they're going to take it up very quickly, with important provisions including the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, fair redistricting, DC statehood, and more. And here's the plea: contact your representative today and tell them to pass the For the People Act. So when you join League, suddenly you're going to get all these requests, and I don't do every one that I get, but it's nice to be able to be heard on these subjects or know that these are the subjects we're pursuing. And here's the third paragraph, which I thought was interesting. This month, the House and Senate introduced legislation to remove the time limit on the Equal Rights Amendment and finally include it in our Constitution. The League has supported ratification of the ERA since it was first passed by Congress in '72, and we have worked for decades for its ratification by the states. Last year, Virginia ratified the ERA, bringing the total state count to the required 38. Now it is time for the legislative branch to pass it and finally include women in the US Constitution. And here's the plea: reach out to your representative now and urge them to support legislation to remove the ERA's ratification deadline. And of course, it's more important to reach out if you have a representative who's on the fence. And that's where local leagues can make a difference. Now, I looked at this and said, wait, we've been doing the ERA since the 1920s. And it's sort of Alice Paul, who was the other great suffrage leader besides Carrie Chapman Cat, who was with the NWS, the women's suffrage organization, North American Women's Suffrage Organization, NASA. She was the president. Alice Paul was radical. She was over here. We've shown the film, Iron-Jawed Angels a couple times locally, and that's about Alice Paul. And I used to ask my classes out at the college in the women's history class, do you think Carrie Cat could have gotten the Congress to vote for women's votes without the radicalism of Alice Paul? Because we go into we discuss it at some length. And they all say no. They had rebuffed people like Carrie Cat for 72 years. And it was Alice Paul who made the difference. Well, Alice Paul created her own organization. She was probably a member of League, I don't know that. But her organization, the women's, I should have written that down, but she had her own organization. And in 1923, they authored the first ERA. And it wasn't Alice Paul. I was checking to see where she went to law school. It was her dear friend and collaborator, Crystal Eastman, who had graduated from the NYU in 1907, second in her class. This is very early now. And that drafting, the language was changed a little bit in 1943, but this is abundantly unchanged since 1923. And it's called the Alice Paul Amendment, or was at one time. And if we get it passed this year in 2021, by my count, it took us 98 years. So when we say that the League has a long view, that's what we're talking about. Now I want to look at advocacy at the state level. And before I turn to our own lobbyist here, who's one among you, you may not know who it is, I'm going to look at this letter from Nick Harper that came out in June, just to show you an example of the kinds of advocacy that the League does. And this one is, this shows the intersection between the university, or the, voter service and program or issue, position on issues, because so much of our issues have to do with elections, the ease of voters to be able to vote. And so here was our involvement, and I'll just jump down. In mid-June, in May, we announced that we had brought a lawsuit against the Secretary of State to drop the witness requirement for absentee ballots in Minnesota. In June, came to a partial agreement with the Secretary of State. We had agreed that the witness requirement for absentee ballots would not be enforced for the 2020 primary election. Our agreement just needed to be approved by the federal judge. Litigation for the November election would continue. So this was not an easy fix. Unfortunately, the federal judge rejected the agreement, stating that he believed the agreement to be too broad. Therefore, our litigation continues. However, despite the fact that our agreement was not approved by the federal judge, pre-registered voters will not need a witness signature for the 2020 primary election. A state court judge has issued a court order in another lawsuit to this effect, and so on. And so it's a partial victory because people registering at the same time, they're requesting an absentee ballot still needed to get a witness to their signature. But this is an important thing that our legislative worker Nick here, the civic engagement director, we call him, Nick Harper, who is himself an attorney, went after. And for someone like me who lives alone, when I got that absentee ballot request, because I was a previously registered voter, I did not in a time of pandemic have to call my neighbor or someone else to witness my signature. I simply signed it and returned it in the mail. So that was a sign of, this is an example of the kind of advocacy you can expect from the state. But the state also calls upon people to appear before the legislature. Oh, and I guess I'm gonna do my historic bit before I come to you, Amy. Clara Euland was the founder and first president of the League of Women Voters of Minnesota. She had worked hard in the suffrage movement, and in 1919 and 1920, they organized the League of Women Voters. She was known for being a really very visible lobbyist up at the state capitol. And she, you know, and there are books on her. We'll see the one I think is the best later. Here's another book written by her daughter. But at the age of 67, and this touched my heart because I'm 67 this year, Clara came home from one of her efforts at the state capitol, got off the streetcar, but there was a truck that went out of control on the hill, a large truck. It struck and killed her. So this was very hard for the early state league. And in their sorrow, you know, you reach out, and one of the things they've done is to install a plaque. This plaque that we're looking at is on the first level of the rotunda at the state capitol. And Dee and I were reading this yesterday. It's really uncannily helpful for our times. So I'm going to read it to you. May her memory save us from all pettiness, all unworthy ambition, all narrowness of vision, all mean and sordid aims. As there was no weakness in her words, no weariness on her brow, no wavering in her loyalties, so may there be none in us. As she fought ever without malice and without hatred, so may we fight. And so I give you today Clara Euland, our founding mother. And let's look at the book that I would recommend on this. Gentle Warriors, it's Barbara Stuhler is professor of women's history at the University of Minnesota. And I've read this book. I think it's a good read, and it tells you how we were founded. But now let's come up to date, because last year we had someone who was advocating before the state legislature, and her name is Amy Cockett. Amy, won't you reminisce a bit for us about your experiences up there?
Trying to unmute there. Well, I have to say I have been very lax this year because I'm not quite sure how to do things.
Yeah.
With
no, stay safe. I think there's a lot less lobbying going on up there, so please.
And as I was even watching Almanac last night, a couple of lobbyists were reporting, this is true for all of us too. Everything that you need to be prepared and to be informed is online. You can get all of the bills. You can find out who's on all the committees. You can even watch or at least listen. You can't watch all, but you can at least listen to every single committee hearing that is going on, because they're all remote now. The problem is having individual interactions. I mean, real lobbying isn't just being informed, it is informing and making sure that the people that represent us or the people in positions to make a difference know what we're thinking. Just to follow the ERA, there was hope this year that there might be some kind of a breakthrough. The state, our state has already passed the national ERA. And of course, at the federal level, we're waiting to see if HR 1 and Senate File 1 move forward, which would say we have it now, and tell I forget who it is that files, somebody over in the archives has to file it And then, of course, there'll be lawsuits because we do have 38, even if we have gone past the deadline. But we do not have a state ERA. And you will be surprised to learn that even places like Texas and Florida have a state ERA that didn't pass the national one. You think that we would be able to have one. I guess we hung our hat on the national. The problem is in both the House and the Senate, it passed the House last year, the state ERA bill. It's been reintroduced in the House and the Senate this year, but unfortunately in the Senate, which is controlled by the Republicans, it is sent to civil law. We were excited because it was not sent to the Judiciary Committee, which is chaired by Warren Limmer, and he refused to even have a hearing last year. But he is the vice chair of civil law. And the person who is the chair is a fairly new guy, Senator Matthews, and I can't imagine, he's even more conservative. I can't imagine he's going to let a hearing happen. The weird thing was how to phrase it. Last year there was how should we use the exact same words in the ERA? This was what the ERA Yes campaign and the League of Women Voters and all the groups that were working together on it. Should we say our rights should not be denied or abridged by any state on account of sex? That's what the federal one says. There was a push to change that word to gender. And oh my gosh, conservatives went crazy because you are opening up equal rights to gay people by saying the word gender. And then how do you define gender? And oh, it was just crazy. On the other hand, since people are much more, it doubles or triples the number of people who are interested in ERA if you do use a word like gender. I noticed that this year, the bill that got introduced in the House and the Senate is just the old-fashioned words, so I don't know which will happen. But none of our people from Olmsted County are on the correct committees. That doesn't mean you can't lobby people that are, but none of them are. Representative Liebling is on the Judiciary Committee in the House, but that's, she is on our side. I guess it's good to tell people you have their back, but she isn't one that needs convincing. Senator Limmer had a scare this year, partly because of the ERA people and also the people that are interested in I'm trying to remember, other liberal groups were trying to dump him. Other bills he refused to bring forward were things that we care about too. The Restore the Vote, to try to get people who are on probation or who are out of prison to be able to vote. And in Minnesota, we have the second fewest number in prison per capita, but we are right near the top in the number of people who are on probation. And we have probation for various drug or sex offenses that go 30 years. So people can be without getting to vote forever and ever. And that's another bill that Senator Limmer was unwilling to take up. But as I say, he had some kind of a scare. He barely won re-election. And so perhaps after redistricting, he might be more beatable. I know we're not supposed to talk about who we're for and against, but people that stand in the way of good legislation that we care about, it's hard not to look at the groups that are trying to make a change there. The League of Women Voters last year, now I don't know how they're going to do it this year, had a day at the Capitol that was very well organized. And the issue that this was on March 6th, the issue we were lobbying on that day, besides hearing an overview of everything, was redistricting. And the bill that we were supporting, that actually was sort of halfway between what the Democrats and the Republicans wanted. And then we all were shown, in case we didn't know, who we were especially concentrating on the Senate, who our senators were. And since our senators were unknown as their positions on this, and our senators were Republican, so the thought was they were probably not going to be as amenable to the League of Women Voters. I had a little bit more to do to try to convince them. A day at the Capitol is really a good thing to do, but I'll tell you that you will be actually more effective from home, even if we have a day at the Capitol, because typically they choose a day that the most people can get there and that they can have access to central meeting areas, which turn out to be Fridays, which turn out to have very few of our legislators are there because everything happens Monday through Thursday. So going up there to greet one another and to hear the talk was informative. But lobbying, you really need to be one-on-one with your people. And now that everybody is going to email, you are going to be much more effective from home talking to your senators, who are Carla Nelson and Dave Senjum, if you're from Rochester, or your representatives, who are Representative Boner, Representative Liebling, Representative Quam, who is a very difficult person to move, but he actually is our only person who is on any of the elections committees, in case you're interested, and Representative Nels Pearson. So those are our people. And I would just suggest that you Google Minnesota legislature or state of Minnesota, and then you will be introduced to all the things that you can get from your own computer to follow things. And if you want to say, like I did last night, what are the actual ERA bills? All you have to do is type in Equal Rights Amendment, and up come all of the bills. Or if you're interested in Restore the Vote, type in that word and you will find out the bills that have been put forward. Then you can see when it's scheduled, if it has been scheduled for a hearing. Often this early in the session, all you know is what committee they are sent to. Fine, look up who is on that committee. Send notes to the people on the committee saying you're watching. Back when I was lobbying in person, I can tell you that if it's a homemade email, not you're forwarding the exact words from some group, really 10 emails can sway a vote, unless it's one of those kind of issues where the political party tells their people, this is how you're going to vote, and this, you may not go one way or another. But so many votes are not party line votes, so they can be open to a good argument, especially the people who are from here. And just because our senators are not on the right committees, our senators, both of whom are Republican, they're in the majority on the Senate, and they are chairs of committees. Dave Senjum is no longer the bonding chair, but he's in charge of energy, and that's kind of and he has an environmental outlook. And Senator Nelson is in charge of the education finance. So they are important people in their caucuses. And before a caucus says, this is how we're going to vote on X, Y, and Z bill, they discuss it in their caucus. And both of our senators will have big voices in those caucuses. So having heard from you on what you think about in Restore the Vote, or what you think about fair maps, or what you think about a state ERA, could have an impact on how they speak in their caucus, which could have they might not sway the caucus to be pro a League of Women Voters position, but they might have enough of a voice to move the caucus from adamantly opposed to letting their people vote however they want, which is a move. We're never going to get everybody all the way over to our position. But if we can get them even incrementally, remember, we're the people that waited 70 or 72 years to get the vote. We're into incrementalism.
Yes, the 98 years of the ERA.
Yeah. So the ERA, the bill is out there. Hopefully it's already passed in the House. It would be wonderful if there could be enough pressure on the people that are Senator Matthews and Senator Limmer to actually move on this year.
Thank you, Amy. You know, one of my favorite stories, and this was probably a long time ago, but if you go to state convention, you hear the stories. And of course, the League does also appear before committees and at hearings. And there was a hearing on semi-automatic weapons, these large, really dangerous looking things. And the story goes, they got the oldest and most petite woman in the League, in this, you know, city leagues, because it's hard for us to get up there. I applaud Amy for all her efforts, but it was her job, so she knows how to do it. And this woman had the gun in her hands, and she entered at the back of the room and walked all through the crowd, all up front, and put it on the table. And that effort failed. And later a legislator told a leaguer, he said, well, you had us before you even said a word. So sometimes a visual can be really significant. And I want to thank Amy, because you also appeared at the legislature last year in your white dress and white hat. And what were you speaking to? Was it the ERA or? Yes. So that's really wonderful. So we have a voice up there. So now the question is, how do we arrive at these position statements? I've told you about the study, or what are they is really where we've arrived to. We know how we've arrived at them. So the next slide shows you the modern image of what we call program for action. And this is what it used to look like. So a lot of our people here today would recognize this, but they've just given it a beautiful new look. And this is, it's still a summary. Remember that these underlying studies can be 20, 30 pages themselves. And then the local leagues would study this, and then we'd have discussion, and then we'd look at the consensus, what we used to call the consensus statements, so just programs or issue statements now. And then we would either agree to them or not. And so this is about a 40-page document, and we can look at the table of contents, D. And so you can see the kinds of things that are represented here. So representative government, we have voting rights, the election process, civil rights. And when we go to read, and I hope we can do it round robin, I hope enough of you have Xeroxed the next summary. So this is one summary, and then we're going to go to this one. So there's a summary and then a summation of the summaries. Now, some of you will recognize, I'm going to show you what they used to do. Here's the citizens' rights. I probably should have maybe sent this to D, but in a box, they'll put the position. And one of the innovations since I've been a part of League is they put the US position on the same subject if there is one. So we can try to keep consistency between the state, the federal, the National League, and local leagues. So this is what we see. And there's a LWV US position on organization of government, and then the LWVMN position. And they're slightly different. I'm going to read to you from the larger thing before we start to share this one. This is a good one to do. So the National League on Organization of Government says the structures of the US Congress must be characterized by openness, accountability, representativeness, decision-making, capability, and effective performance. Presidential power should be exercised within the constitutional framework of a dynamic balance between the executive and legislative branches. Accountability and responsibility to the people require unnecessary secrecy between the president and Congress be eliminated. So we're thinking in terms of the voter. So we don't want Congress and the president keeping secrets. This was revised in 1982. That means the original study was previous to that. And they decided they had to study a few more things and add to the position. Now, let's look at Minnesota position on the same issue. Organization of government. Support improved structure and procedures for the Minnesota legislature and executive branch. Support of an improved process for amending the Minnesota Constitution. Support timely redistricting based substantially on population and affecting all state and local government districts. Oppose unicameral state legislature. So now some of these statements, and they don't put a date because the unicameral legislature piece was brought up by Governor Jesse Ventura. He thought it was a way to save money and simplify things and sort of change, probably upset the apple cart, knowing him a little bit. And so that was actually something that was added to this position. So these positions get updated and added to. And you can look at this online. Say you wanted to ask something about an underlying study. You could ask the State League to give you the copy of the study. They have it all there. They once said, don't keep our files for us, local leagues. So we don't have all of them here. And anyways, it's been decades. It's decades of studies. But all of those could be made available to you if you want to look at the underlying studies. And nowadays, the reason we don't do very many studies in the last decade, or even two, I would argue, well, decade, is they're very expensive. And we've gone beyond using volunteers, and we usually hire professors from colleges who are studying these issues and who have a lot of knowledge already under their belt on something. Well, now it's your chance to talk. I've talked enough. And if you look at this, it's pretty easy to read this. Do I have a brave soul willing to read this? We'll take it by pieces. So the large blue letters, voting rights, everything under that, I would ask someone to read. Who's brave enough to do that for me? This is how we've always done these in the past when we're together. So I'm hoping we could do it this way virtually. Ginny, thank you. Go ahead.
So when you mean like citizens' right to vote and restoration and elections, all
Yes,
that?
right.
Okay.
Let's break it like that.
Okay, so under voting rights, citizens' right to vote. The US position is protect the right of all citizens to vote, encourage all citizens to vote. Restoration of voting rights, Minnesota position, allows citizens living in the community on probation or parole to vote. Elections, the Minnesota position, support improvements in election laws, regulating election procedures, voting and school district elections, specifically centralized responsibility in the state government for achieving uniform election procedures and for training election officials. Extension of mandatory voter registration prior to election day to cover more voters through inclusion of more municipalities through countywide registration or through statewide registration. Extension of election laws to cover school district elections, including uniform, mandatory voter registration. Rotation of names of candidates for the same office on ballots.
And you see the years noted there, and Ginny isn't mentioning them. So different issues related to this come up at different times. But this is the major summary. Now, one of the reasons we're bringing this forward every year is to say, does anyone want to suggest that we should change any of these positions or that we need further study? Now, I have to tell you, it's always a long shot that you're going to get that. I mean, we have sent up comments on these before. I never get a response. They just accept them. But if there were something major, there could be a grassroots swelling of desire to change, and then we would have to do that. And yeah, Ed, go ahead.
Well, based on this past cycle's experience, I don't hear anything specifically mentioning mail-in ballots. Did I just misinterpret?
No, this is a summary. And so you're right. We heard from Nick Harper that he was working on the mail-in ballot process and the league did participate. I think they would probably put that under the, the national is better in that sense of supporting the right of all citizens to vote, encouraging all citizens to vote. And I would argue that the language that I've often heard is removing impediments to voting. And I believe that witness signature or disallowing mail-in ballots or saying you had to have some major excuse that you could prove up as to why you weren't personally going to the you know, the polling place were impediments, and then they've been removed. But yeah, this, you know, we could argue that we need to have a more explicit statement. But clearly, oh, you know, I jumped over something, and maybe this helps with your question, Ed. Something they've done on the statement of our positions at the website is to suggest that there are core issues, okay? And the core issues are for voting and election administration, and that gets to your point, Ed. So there is another place you can go and hit, and you'll get more detail, and I think you'd find it there. Redistricting reform is one, money in politics, and then the 2020 census. Now, I think the census was asked as a core issue. It says LWVMN works on at least one of these issues almost every year in some way. While we have positions and take actions on other issues, these are issues most relevant to our mission of empowering voters and defending democracy. They tend to receive higher priority than other issues. And so what they've done under each of these, this is what I didn't know, and Dee, I did skip over that. Can we go back to the flyer that we were going to put in? Okay, so money in politics, if you click on it, you know, you'll get explanatory material, but they'll also say, you know, if you're going to do a program for your local league on money in politics, or you're going to meet the public and say, this is what we stand for, they've produced flyers for 3 of these organizations, or 3 of three of the core issues. They don't have a flyer for the 2020 census, even though this is, we used to call these issues for emphasis, that we would pick up a piece and we would do that. And they're letting you know that they're always working on one of these issues. But here we have a lot of information that comes from the State League that you can share, or if you're just interested, you can print this flyer. And what reforms are needed in Minnesota, it's very specific information. But yeah, we're working on absentee ballots, and it doesn't even show up in this summary, but it's in the underlying documents. Does that help, Ed?
Jane?
Yes. Hi,
Excuse
Ray.
me, Jane, this is Ray.
Hi.
I was going to go to your subdivision on the judiciary for a little informational item.
Yeah.
There was a good commentary on where we are with the Biden administration and Trump's court packing, recognizing that obviously there's nothing we can do about his 200 questionable judicial appointments and 3 Supreme Court appointments. But the Biden administration has decided not to use the American Bar Association rating program to qualify judges. The argument that they made is that it takes 30 days or more to go through that process. They want to move more quickly. So that obviously, you know, we'll see that, and the ABA can still comment on an appointee as anyone else can.
Mm-hmm.
They just don't have the opportunity to get a advance notice of who the proposed appointees are. This particular commentary was obviously behind a paywall, like everything is, so I can't forward it. He suggested that things are certainly somewhat dire, but the question then is, what are the other alternatives? One of them obviously is to exercise the legislature's power to limit what can happen on legislation, in particular in terms of review by the Supreme Court. There are people proposing that happen. Obviously, I guess it judges the age of this particular commentator. He said some younger activists are proposing the expansion of the Supreme Court, which he doesn't think will get a lot of traction from the mainstream members of the Biden administration. He also noted that, I guess I mentioned that, noted that the legislature has the power to limit the Supreme Court's jurisdiction on some matters. That appeals to me because it, I think, restores what traditionally was the role of the legislature and the administrative branch to make laws. Today, we have a veto power that is increasingly being exercised by members of the third branch, the judiciary, and they are not exercising their power in a way that respects what happens in the legislature and the administrative branch. So,
okay, now you're speaking at the federal level pretty much completely, aren't you? And
oh
today
yes, of course.
I'm talking about the
this
federal.
is the U.S. District Court and the
Right.
U.S. Supreme Court.
Right. Well, actually, one piece of news, Ray, that I don't know if you've heard is that a lot of judges are resigning to give Biden more chance to appoint, but they tend to be people who are, pro one side or the other. But yeah, this, that whole question up at the national level. And so you went into a deep dive on the US LWV US site, and you found commentary on this and discussion of where the League of Women Voters is on it. Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm saying that there is a recent column, I believe in the New York Times, discussing at some length the state of the judiciary. This was not a League of Women Voters publication. This was something which I wish I could share with people, but as I said, paywalls limit my
Sure.
ability to do that.
Well, thank you for that. I think we're going to stay focused mostly on state positions today. Next year, we'll be doing the federal, and we're going to focus on what the league has already said. But yeah, these issues come up fast and quick, and I would argue that sometimes, no system is perfect, but there may be, you have to extrapolate from the study you have, and sometimes they take positions that, did the underlying study really say that a unicameral legislature isn't the right thing to do? That was one that I wondered about at the time. So, but we'll get to the judiciary in Minnesota. So let's move to the election process. And can I have another reader? Do you want to read? Is your hand in the air, Ray?
Oh, I can, sure. Selection of the election process. Their initial discussion is selection of the president.
Right, thank you.
U.S. League's position is promotes the election of the president and vice president by direct popular vote. In other words, eliminating the current system. Support uniform national voting qualifications and procedures for presidential electors, which, yeah, they suggest outlawing electors, but then they say if
the
we're
word
not
is election.
we have support efforts to provide voters with sufficient information about candidates, 70 and 76. And in Minnesota, support improvements in election laws regulating election procedures, voting, and school district elections. And that, of course, gets into what we mentioned, the question of absentee, of mail-in ballots, and how that is managed. And there are already, as you probably saw in the news, proposals to require photo ID and in-person voting.
Right, and we've worked hard on voter ID in the past. And here is that supporting information for Ed. Support improvements in election laws regulating election procedures. And I just want to back up. The second sentence read by Ray reads, support uniform national voting qualifications and procedures for presidential elections. Now it wasn't electors. You just read it wrong, Ray, but that's.
You're right.
There you go. So it's not inconsistent.
Locals.
But
Thank you. Thank
But,
you.
the thing that could fall in here that I'm looking for is some formal requirement, because this is presidential elections, procedures and qualifications. We might have to put into law somewhere that the presidential candidates are required to release their IRS forms for a certain period of time. So, whenever you look at these, some current issue can pop up and suddenly it's supported by a position that we have. So thank you. Let's move to apportionment and redistricting, another very, very key issue for us in these recent times. Who would like to read that 2 paragraphs there?
I can read, Jane.
Thank you, Kathy.
Apportionment and redistricting. The U.S. position, congressional districts and government legislative bodies should be apportioned substantially on population. This was revised in 1982. The League believes responsibility for redistricting preferably should be vested in an independent special commission with membership that reflects the diversity of the unit of government, including citizens at large, representatives of public interest groups, and members of minority groups. That was 2016. Minnesota, support timely redistricting based substantially on population and affecting all state and local governmental bodies. Regular and equitable reapportionment with definite procedures established to ensure prompt redistricting by the legislature or by a reapportionment commission. Support of procedures which provide for compact, contiguous districts giving advantage to no particular person or group, public accessibility to legislative or commission deliberations and action, prompt judicial review. And that was in 1979.
Yes. So the basic position is this kind of a panel. It's been used in other states and it was championed. I think 2016 is the reason that is there is because Mondale and Arnie Carlson and people were trying to come up with a solution here. But if you're going to have a judicial review back in 1979, as the redistricting plans would always get kicked out of the legislature and the courts would decide them, although I appreciate Ray has said, they have a pretty good system now for getting that done, but prompt judicial review is another important thing, that the redistricting not drag on until you have to have it done by the next election cycle. And it used to be that we'd have elections year round, so redistricting would have to happen even more quickly. But now with the 2-year cycle, it makes everything a little more reasonable, I think. And easier for League. We used to have candidate forms in May because that's when the school board election was. So, it used to be a year-round thing and every year. Good. Money in politics. These are bread and butter. We have 2 pages like this to get through. So who else would like to read? I can't talk anyone else into reading. I'm looking at my next page.
I can.
Hand in the air, Deb, please.
Okay, you can hear me now. Okay,
Yes.
money in politics. U.S. position. Campaign finance regulations should enhance political equality for all citizens, ensure transparency, protect representative democracy from distortion by big money, and combat corruption and undue influence in government. The League believes that campaign spending must be restricted, but not banned. The League supports public financing, full disclosure, abolishing super PACs, and creating an effective enforcement agency. That's the U.S. position. Minnesota, support improvements in election laws regulating campaign practices. The public's right to comprehensive disclosure of all political campaign contributions and expenditures. Mandatory, timely, uniform, and complete reports of campaign contributions and expenditures should be made to a central authority responsible for disseminating such information to the public. Responsibility for reporting contributions to the candidate's campaign and for reporting expenditures by the candidate and those made on the candidate's behalf rests squarely on the candidate. Penalties should be stringent enough to ensure compliance by candidates. So that's in 1961. judicious use of public resources to finance campaigns. That was 1972. And reduction of the amount of money spent on campaigns, also 1972. Imagine what they would say now if they saw how much was spent.
And that's one reason I showed you that flyer on money in politics. So there's a much updated version of this, but we're looking at the bedrock that comes underneath it. Here's judiciary, back to Ray's point. I'm going to read this quickly. Support a judicial system. This is in the state of Minnesota now. We don't have a US position that we plucked out. We could, but you know, judicial systems are pretty separate. The state courts are separate from the federal courts. Support a judicial system with the capacity to assure a speedy trial and equal justice for all. 1973, selection of judges. And this has been an important piece. Initial appointment of judgeship by the governor, who must choose from among a list of qualified candidates forwarded by a nominating commission. B, end of term evaluation of the judge's performance by an evaluation commission, results to be made available to the public. And finally, C, retention election. Voters choose to retain or not retain the judge. 2008. And the idea there was that, you know, we shouldn't, you know, electing judges, the public doesn't really have that information, but they may have enough information to say whether this judge should remain in office or not. So that's really something that hasn't come about, but is a position the league has and could argue for. Okay, are we ready to move on? If I see no questions, I'm going to move on. Natural resources. So this is a wonderful area. Mary Jones, would you read, please? Thank you.
Yes, natural resource management, U.S. promote resource conservation, stewardship, and long-range planning, and the responsibility for managing natural resources shared by all levels of government.
And why don't you read on the next three?
Okay, thank you. Environmental protection and pollution control, air quality, U.S. promote measures to reduce pollution from mobile and stationary sources. Minnesota, development of more energy efficient transportation systems. Energy, U.S. support environmentally sound policies that reduce energy growth rates, emphasize energy conservation, and encourage the use of renewable resources.
And on the next page, I want you to keep going, Mary, because there's going to be more here. Read through water resources.
Water resources, U.S. support measures to reduce pollution in order to protect surface water, groundwater, and drinking water. Minnesota, support a state role in the preservation and management of Minnesota's water resources through protection, allocation, conservation, pricing, and interbasin transfer policies protective of current and future needs, 1985.
Why don't you take the next two and then we'll turn to agriculture, but I think these should be read as a whole.
Okay.
Waste management.
Waste management, U.S. promote policies that reduce the generation and promote the reuse and recycling of solid and hazardous waste. Minnesota, support measures to reduce generation of solid waste and ensure safe treatment, storage, and disposal of all waste. Land use, U.S. promote policies that manage land as a finite resource and that incorporate principles of stewardship. Minnesota, support an overall land use plan with maximum cooperation and implementation at the regional and local level with state help in developing and exercising land use management with opportunity for maximum local decision-making and with regional planning and regulation for matters of more than local concern.
Great. So that is the position of the league. And you know, there's been a lot of work on this area, and I know it's an area of concern to some of you. Amy Cockett, I'm going to give you a little shout out here. She's doing a series of programs on Know Your Government. And the one I would like to propose, which I'm reminded of here, so I'm just going to say it, is I would love to hear the water commissioners, maybe in a panel discussion, discuss their role and what they do, because we vote for them and we don't usually, you know, have them engaged in a candidates forum. We don't need more work in voter service, but I think it would help the public to know. So I'm putting a bug in your ear, Amy. What do you think? Wouldn't that be a helpful thing?
I just don't know how many people would bother attending.
Well, if it's virtual and it's as cold as today, maybe they would.
I
But
think you
anyway.
could do it to be kind of funny. Here are hidden levels of government, which is the Water and Soil, Water and Soil Commission, and also, of course, the group that you and I were on, that was the Charter Commission.
Charter Commission for the city, but those are not elected officials. Okay?
No, but
The
they
public-
picked.
Yes.
No, the
They matter.
Charter Commission is appointed by the chief judge in the district.
Right. And when I moved outside of the city, they kicked me out. They said, get out of here. You're living in the township. But
You were
I
great.
do think that because the public votes for the water and soil commissioners, that would be nice to have an informative. Anyways, I'm giving a suggestion to the program chair here.
Jane,
Yes,
if I
Ray?
could comment quickly on the land use and the state of Minnesota position.
Sure.
We really, the league should be monitoring what's happening in the city of Rochester / Olmsted County at this point in time. The historic planning relationship between the city and the county has been severed, as you're probably aware. We have no idea what's going to happen in terms of the county land use plan, the city land use plan, what they're going to say, how they're going to recognize what the league's goals are. So that's something that the chapter should be paying attention to in the next year or two.
Thank you. And that brings it down to the local level. That there is local leagues can study things like this, they can participate, and it might be a critical time to start doing a little bit of, what do we call it when we have an observer corps to find out how those groups are going to handle their new split responsibility after years of being successful as a joint county city planning department. Yes, this is a change, and it's a change at the local level. And I thank you for that comment, Ray. That's a good thing to bring up here. Let's move to agricultural policies. Is there anyone who wishes to read, who has not yet read? Or anyone who would like to read again? Since there's not so many of us, which is great, but.
I'll read
Oh,
again.
Anna Fruling had her hand up. I had to get to the other faces.
You can hear me. You can hear me, right?
We can hear you.
Okay. So agricultural policies. U.S. promote adequate supplies of food and fiber at reasonable prices to consumers and support economically viable farms, environmentally sound farm practices, and increase reliance on the free market. Minnesota support a system of sustainable agricultural production, which provides safe, healthful foods, and which preserves and protects the state's human and natural agricultural resources and enhances the environment. Research and technical assistance in farming practices and rural economies that improve the economic viability of family farms, environmental health, and the quality of life of family farms and their communities. And I just want to add one thing is that last year in February, Amy Cockett, there was an email from Nick Harper at the state, and there was an elections committee hearing up at the Capitol, and Amy sent out an email and said, anybody want to go with? And I went with her. It was a cold winter day, kind of like today, and the sun was shining, and Amy knows her way around the Capitol, and she took me up there. We zipped to the elections committee. It was really interesting to watch. They were having a hearing on provisional balloting, and just listening to the arguments and seeing Nick Harper testify at the against the provisional ballot was really interesting. And then we went up and met Carla Nelson, and I had an issue I was lobbying on, so I talked to her about that. And I'm sure when we can do in-person lobbying again, or going up to the Capitol, Amy would be happy to go up there. I would go up with her again, because it was really a wonderful experience to do that and to actually see it in action and to be able to talk to your legislators up there. So anyway, I had to put that in.
Oh, I'm so glad you did. That's the kind of experience that can be made available to people, and we don't do it enough. We don't do it enough, Anna, so I'm glad that you went, and so on. And I'm trying to think of, what the governor, or there was this effort to change the streams and how far into the stream you had to dam or so on. And so you can see there's general statements here about maintaining natural resources and keeping agriculture strong, and that could be used to comment on those kinds of issues. Now, we're almost done, ladies and gentlemen, and then I just have one little comment before we wrap up. So social policy, who wants to read?
I can
Amy.
read about
Great. Yeah, take sort of equality of opportunity education.
Okay.
Well, then maybe we better break for discussion before fiscal policy. It's too different.
Okay. Social policy, secure equal rights. Equal opportunity for all, promote social and economic justice, and health and safety of all Americans. And that's the area that the support for the Equal Rights Amendment is. Equality of opportunity, U.S. Support equal access to education, employment, and housing, Minnesota. Support policies to ensure equality of opportunity in employment, real property, public accommodations, education, and other public services for all persons. Support administrative enforcement of anti-discrimination laws. Support state responsibility for and responsiveness to American Indian citizens. Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, do education.
Education, Minnesota. All Minnesota children should have equal access to a good public education. State funding for education should be at the level that makes programs of comparable substance and quality available to all. A student's access to a good education should not depend on the wealth of his or her school district. And of course, you probably are aware that Ellen Page and Neil Kashkari are pushing for an amendment to the Minnesota Constitution to have a civil right that all children wouldn't just have uniform education, but would have quality education, of course, undefined, which means lawsuits if that happens to pass. But who would ever vote against it? I don't know.
Yeah, it's sort of like mother and apple pie.
Right.
The other piece I like in here, oh, sorry, did someone have a comment? I'm going to just highlight this other one because it speaks to this question of effectiveness of government, or, trying to, whether or not government follows through with its obligations. So look at this statement in Minnesota: equality of opportunity, support administrative enforcement of anti-discrimination laws. That clearly became an issue under this area, but I would argue it's there for everything. Enforcement of pollution laws, enforcement of food inspection laws. This question of the operation of government is very key. And it's sort of funny that it jumps up right here, because there was clearly some concern that this was, we had the good legislation on the books, but was it happening? Was it happening? And was there the political will to do it? Okay, let's go on to fiscal policy. We're doing well. I think we're going to make it. I'll just read this one because I think it's very different than healthcare. So Minnesota, support a balanced and diversified revenue system that is equitable, competitive, competitive with other states, progressive and reliable. Support long-term financial management, projections, and a budget reserve. Okay, so the rainy day fund, as they often call it in the state of Minnesota. It's hard to be opposed to any of that, but we have a position here. So if some issue comes up, we can speak to it. Who would like to read healthcare? That's a pretty big one. I need to go to the next. Anyone have, Ginny, do you have your hand in the air? Thank you.
I can read it.
Please do.
Healthcare. And just the healthcare one, right?
Yeah, but go all the way through it.
US, promote a healthcare system for the United States that provides access to a basic level of quality care for all US residents, including behavioral health and controls healthcare costs. Every US resident should have access to a basic level of care that includes the prevention of disease, health promotion and education, primary care, including prenatal and reproductive health, acute care, long-term care, mental health care. In Minnesota, support a comprehensive and coordinated system of programs and services for mentally ill adults and emotionally disturbed children and adolescents. Priority should be given to persons with serious and persistent mental illness or acute mental illness. Public policy and funding should sustain an array of community-based services which are available and accessible to persons with mental illness. Administration of that policy should provide clients with appropriate and adequate services. 1989.
Yes. I'm trying to decide how we can apply this to masks. Sorry, I don't think we have time to go into a discussion of that, but you know, that's the kind of thing that these can be used for. Immigration. I even worked on violent. Oh,
Ed has his hand up.
Ed? Oh, who
All right,
has
great.
that?
Yeah, quickly. One area of medical health that I do not hear mentioned, and again, it may be implied, is dental. And I think we have a real problem in this nation on the issue of dental care.
Right, and there hasn't been much, is there a lot of legislation pending on that? Have you heard anything, Ed? You're just pointing out that we need to consider that.
Correct.
Yeah, no, and a lot of it's done voluntarily because I have friends who volunteer in the dental clinics that are held, you know, out of the goodness of their heart. And sometimes when government is not providing services, I mean, it's sort of Bush's 1,000 points of light. There are people who simply volunteer and start to provide those services, but it's not systematic. It doesn't reach everyone. You know, there are problems when you just say, well, we're going to fill this gap in the system with volunteers who are doing good work, when really it needs to be addressed with legislation. So I think that's an excellent point. I'm going to make a point of that.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, Jane, I
Comment?
think we have to, we should pay attention to the funding for those community dental clinics, which the state is now starting and funding, but we have to make sure that the funding stream doesn't dry up.
Right, and that it's, you know, they tend to be made available to, you know, populations, you know, very vulnerable populations. But it's hard for me to think, how do you reach everyone? That's the thing that makes it hard. But thank you for that.
Yeah, and we also have the, I guess, I don't know whether they're up and running yet, but the roll out of the regional mental health clinics, one of which is in Rochester. We need to support that and continue to advocate for its funding, because obviously that's the big danger, that people get used to a program like that and the funding dries up and the building becomes a warehouse.
Excellent point. Excellent. Thank you for that discussion. Immigration.
I was just going to ask a question. So you've
Yes.
added, you're going to like Edward's comment about dental care. You're going to send that to state then?
Yes. Yeah, I made a note of that. And the other comment on the city and county, that's really a local issue, applying a state position to a local issue. So the main one I picked up today, did I miss anything else, Jenny? But the dental issue here, I think, is the sort of a very helpful comment. So I will send that to Nick as a comment and see if it gets, you know, support. That's one of the things to do. Immigration position. People can reread. We have 2 more to go and 10 minutes.
I can read.
I will read. Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Go ahead.
Immigration. U.S. Promote reunification of immediate families. Meet the economic, business, and employment needs of the United States. Be responsive to those facing political persecution or humanitarian crises, and provide for student visas. ensure fair treatment under the law for all persons, in transition to a reformed system, support provisions for unauthorized immigrants already in the country to earn legal status. Minnesota, support incorporating immigrants into our communities by providing access to education, by endorsing the development of secure identification documents, and by respecting the right of law enforcement personnel to perform their duties without the burden of interpreting federal immigration policies. Oppose residents with legal immigration status running for local office, 2003.
And that, of course, would require a constitutional change. Now, one thing you'll see if you go to the website just before this appears is after core issues, summaries for other select positions. And on immigration, they're bringing up a new topic. So it's not here in what Kathy just read, but I'm going to read it to you. The first line is promote reunification of immediate families. So at the time that this study happened, probably people didn't think that would ever occur. Now we can say that these underlying studies talk about the welfare of the family and treating them fairly and treating them with some cultural sensitivity. And so now under the state league has made a statement here. It's an interpretation of the language Kathy read, but it says we will promote the reunification of immediate families in the immigrant group. And so that's the way we see these statements happen, and then they evolve. I'm going to read violence prevention, support violence prevention programs in community. That's the US position. Minnesota, support violence prevention programs in our community, 1994. Support improved procedures for agencies dealing with family violence. Support improved services for the victims. And I want to mention here, we haven't talked a lot about local, there's never enough time, but the local league did study, because I was on that study, the early arrest in domestic assault cases. It was based on a Duluth model. They had started this idea that you don't come in and try to, mediate between the parties. If there has been an assault, if there is evidence of injury, you arrest. And that has been, was a position that was ultimately adopted. So underneath all of this is that level of local activity on them. We can use the state position if we wish, but where we're advocating something for the local, we need to study it ourselves and take a position. So I wanted to share that little gloss there.
Jane, let me make a couple quick comments.
Sure, Ray.
One, the Olmsted County has funded several social work positions to respond with the police department to family issue calls, which has been working apparently very well. There was a long article on reducing a threat of violence from a person really attempting to probably commit suicide by cop. So that's a very good program. I think we ought to suggest to Nick that the state support the implementation of those kinds of programs on a statewide basis. The other thing that I want to recognize is that the National League responded to the previous administration's attempt to zero out the VAWA program, Violence Against Women's Act. They were eliminating the funding for the program entirely. When one of the few instances where the Congress got its back up, they put funding back in place, and it was in a budget bill that could not be vetoed or would not be vetoed, and the VAWA program continued. And as a matter of fact, they increased the funding, which was kind of a spit in his eye sort of response. So that's an area where we need to recognize what the national has worked to accomplish in this area.
That's being thrown.
Wonderful. I mean, there is great complexity to government. So now my second comment is going to be, and a lot of these health professionals going along with police was after the Floyd riots, George Floyd's, and the upheaval with how do we change police, how do we improve them, and the state did it, but our local, both the Rochester Police and the Olmsted County started to tap into mental health professionals to be of assistance on certain types of police calls. So that's a really good point, and I will forward that to state as well. Gun control. Our final thing, sorry, let's go back. I'll just read it. Protect the health and safety of citizens through limiting the access and regulating the ownership of handguns and semi-automatic weapons. Support regulations of firearms for consumer safety, the US position. Minnesota, support restrictions on the sale, possession, and use of firearms by private parties in the state of Minnesota, passed in 1990. Well, lots of good discussion. I've appreciated it. And I want to make one final point. And that was earlier I talked about some of the famous lobbyists that the league has had. We can move to the next slide. Oh, there's the state, or the state capitol. This is our state capitol, and we know that they're on high alert as groups have said they're going to do things to the state capitol, but I wanted to just put this in here. And finally, I want to talk about Carrie Chapman Cat. She was the national leader of NASA and became the first leader of the National League of Women Voters, our president. She was very effective. And actually, she went on to work in the international field. She worked on women's issues throughout the world and went to conventions and things like that. So I've been aware of her, Carrie Chapman Cat, for a long time. What I didn't know is that her childhood home is a house museum, which is only 90 miles south of here in Charles City, Iowa. So I want to say to all of you, when the pandemic is over, I want to go and you're all invited. Let's have a field trip. So I want to thank everyone for being part of today's discussion, for reviewing the positions of this organization that you have either joined or support by being here today. And you know, this conversation is always ongoing. And thank you to Amy for participating, and thank you to everyone who made comments. And with that, do I need to do anything more? Dee.
I just want to point out that Anna put a couple links in the chat if people hadn't noticed that. And you can save the chat and look at those links later if you want to do that.
Wonderful. How do I save the chat? I don't know how to do that.
At the bottom of the chat box, way to the right, there are 3 dots.
I'm hitting it.
If you
Save
click on
chat.
that, the first thing, and then it saves it in a file in a Zoom folder on your computer.
Well, thank you. I keep learning new things by going to Zoom meetings, and I really am dumb about it. So I really appreciate that. I just did my first save of a chat box, everybody. And I hope you'll do the same if it's on your, in your interest to have all of these things to refer to. But I think we've done our duty in terms of, thank you. And Ray has put up a nice festive party piece there. But this is a chance to look and take a deep dive into the state positions. Next year, about this same time, we'll be focusing further on the United States League of Women Voters position, because this year we go to state convention, which I suspect will be virtual. So I hope many of you will go. And remember, every other year we do budget money to send a delegate to the national convention. And that would be in 2022, probably Washington, DC, though occasionally they go elsewhere, occasionally. It's a great experience. I've had the privilege of going twice in the 30 years I've been in this organization, and I encourage you to consider it. So with that, I'll say thank you, and we are adjourned at 11:30 exactly.